very happy to be here today, and I want to thank very much the Connections team for inviting me, and I want to thank you for coming. I hope that it will be a lecture quite entertaining for you, so that you don't feel you waste your time. Having said that, so that you might know that the year theme in Connections is about, of the public program, is about the idea of moralise, which are territorial communities, and they are very much in relation to the context of contemporary Ukraine. And with this theme in mind, I actually got inspired and came here today to present part of my research that I've been doing over the last 5 years on the emergence and evolution of purpose-built housing schemes and the communities that live in there since their construction. So the case studies that I focus today is called Cité Ouvrière. It is in the city of Mulhouse in France, and it's basically a 19th century working class settlement that was built to accommodate the workers of local industries. And you may think that this is an old case study, but what I believe, and hopefully by the end of the lecture you will also be able to be convinced, is that there are certain lessons that we can learn from that they are absolutely relevant today, and that they are relevant when we are dealing with issues of mass displacement of people, of immigration, of planning, and of housing crisis, and how we deal with the ever-changing living habits of our societies. So for these case studies, 5 years ago, I got particularly interested in seeing how things are changing over time, and how the scheme has changed over time, how the buildings have changed over time, but also what that meant for the people that live there. And as an architect, I had to ask what is the role of architecture and urban design in literally in shaping the life of the inhabitants that live them, but also to help them claim their right to the city and their claim to and their right to citizenship. And given that Cité Ouvrière was the first settlement that provided access to property for the workers, I could not help but wonder, okay, how is then housing and ownership used as instruments to reform our society in the past, but also if it is similar and relevant today. So obviously this is a long-term study, and I've been working with a range of different methodologies from different scales as well, from analyzing the street network using the theory and methods of space syntax. Maybe you know, maybe you don't. I'm happy to discuss and elaborate on that further after the talk. On mapping socioeconomic data at the block level or the district level, mapping volumetric exterior changes of the houses over time, but also visiting the archives and going through the building permits for every single address, or going on site and visiting families and talking with them about their neighborhood and meeting them and understanding what is to be there. And this kind of different range of methodologies, what I feel is that it gave me the opportunity to have a complete or comprehensive image of the topic and the issue I'm researching, and basically trace the transformation over time of what used to be a top-down planned residential scheme to what ended up being a rather emergent, bottomly up, diverse city quarter. So basically the structure of my lecture today is going to be the following. I will start with the historical and social context behind the housing reform movement in 19th century. Can everybody read this font? Okay, I'm done, I'm cool with that. So the first one is talking about the housing reform movement in the 19th century. That actually was the background that fed the emergence of company towns, which are working class settlements, and then I will zoom in the working class settlements in France, and particularly the Cité Ouvrière in Mulhouse, and giving the socio-spatial evolution background during its construction, but also after its construction, And basically making the argument how these case studies can inform us on how people can turn from passive consumers of a housing product and a service to active participants in the aging and in the life of that product. So, again, historical, stay with me, don't give up, it's becoming better along the way. So, by the end of the 19th century, there was a general concern in Europe regarding the living conditions of the workers. Journals of the time, such as the Charity Organization Review and British Medical Journal, were discussing the congestion of populations in industrial areas and the absence of adequate or proper housing. Due to the overcrowding, epidemic diseases were spreading like tuberculosis and resulting in high rates of mortality. Historians of that time describe that all sexes mingled in cramped quarters, beds were shared, and the numbers of cabaret and wine shops in each block continued to grow. Workers paid on Saturday were still sleeping off the effects of alcohol on Monday, and these were often the better paid segments of the working class. So the middle class, the so-called bourgeoisie, and the public health activists considered the poor quality of housing to be the root of the problem. It was the one to blame for driving the workers to cabarets, their wives in prostitutions, and the children to the streets. The paradox is that while they thought there is an acute shortage of housing, they were actually reluctant to intervene, either because that would raise the taxes from the taxpayers, or they would infringe the rights to landowners where they would need to build housing, or it would be fears of conspiracy that once we provide something for the workers, then they will conspire against us. And the situation, though, was getting worse once the factories were moving out of the cities. Then the workers, so the productivity, the industrial production was growing. They had to move out of the city center, who was struggling to accommodate the industries, but the workers then had to commute. They had to spend money and time to go from their house to actually the new location of the factory. And that was not something they could afford. Also, it was something that were depriving them from what we call material deprivation, from everyday services and goods. So going to the hospital, to the school, to the grocery store, if you have to wake up at 5 and come back by 11. So a lot of workers were actually either quitting their jobs because they couldn't afford it, or demanding higher wages. And new ones from other areas could also not be able to come and be hired because they still have to overcome the distance. So apart from a housing crisis, actually the problem was becoming a very economic one, and something that the industries had to solve because they were running out of options. So the response to these challenges came with the emergence of company towns. And that was around the second half of 19th century. And company towns were massive housing schemes funded, operated and managed and constructed by the private industries. They were built next to the factories so that there is no commuting time for the workers, and also because that would allow the productivity to increase. The towns were spread across Europe and they differed in size and layout. However, they shared some common characteristics. So, from a morphological point of view, they were all large-scale, low-rise and low-density. They were self-contained in the sense that they were bounded in some kind of territory. They were built on remote location following basically the flight of the factory outside in the periphery of the city, so they were next to them remotely. And also because the price of the land in the city was increasing. They were characterized by architectural standardization. We will talk about that in a minute. From an operational point of view, they feature subsidized tenancy to the workers, social hierarchy in the scheme, so who goes where and why, economic and political dependence, as well as an advanced infrastructure that was basically provided by the industrials for purposes of hygiene. The standardization of their design is what I find the most impressive, because it was also the most apparent characteristics. And if you, I mean, this is from a different case. This is from Levittown years later, but maybe it's the most famous example that many of you may know. And interestingly, when the American sociologist Herbert Guns did a research on Levittown, he found that the suburban homogeneity was used as a means to create a unity and cohesion in the society when that didn't exist before. Other research done by British sociologists, Liz Spencer and Ray Paul, on personal communities and friendships in working class settlement, found that social networks and community attachment was rooted in sometimes in a particular place, in a particular locale, especially for people who have not been geographically mobile before, or they have been uprooted and relocated, which was the case in our workers. They have been relocated from their previous neighborhood and then just put there, and then they had to start making sense of a community out of it, and start afresh in the new area. So in the case of the company town, the geographer John Douglas Porteous describes them as a sea of housing in a uniform style. The design of houses and of the urban layout was deliberately used to condition the social life of the inhabitants. The historian Michael Honhart reveals that uniformity was meant to induce a feeling of unity under one command, that of the industry. He finds that this worked well, maybe on the small level, like within the community itself, but actually what it did, it insulated the workers from the influences and the benefits of a larger community, of the urban life, that it was far away. So, despite the noble cause of the company towns, they were actually political and economic measures to remedy the social and moral state of the workforce. They served a reformist agenda that what I found were three objectives. The first one was to alleviate the tension between the employees and the employers and silence the syndicalism or unionism. So, in 1894, the socialist Benoit Malon noted that by tying the worker to a 15 or 20-year mortgage obligation, the employer diminished his economic leverage and was making it very hard for the worker to actually change job or go on a strike. Police reports of that time actually find that workers that were tied or paying mortgage to their employer were the least to be able to sustain a strike. The second objective was social control. So if a worker was living in a house that was provided by his employer and he was paying rent to him, he was automatically placed in an inferior bargaining situation when it comes to his working rights. For example, there were reports of employers forcing their employees to take in fellow employers, to bar the children from working to another firm, or even if the worker was actually being fired, or he was involved in unwanted political activities, then he would be evicted from his house usually in a matter of days or weeks. So, the third objective is the moral transformation through home ownership. And the idea was that the industrialists and the reformers wanted to transform the workers from uprooted nomads to settled petty proprietors. Reformers believe that moral reform will inevitably follow domestic reform. So, if we provide a house and the house is owned by the worker, then this will turn the worker into what is in French ouvrière arrangée, which means a well-behaved, orderly, disciplined, family, sober man that takes care of his family and cultivates his garden. So, I put here this statement because I think it makes it very, very lively. So this is a statement written by the editor-in-chief of La Réforme Sociale, which was a publication at the time by economists and reformers. And he writes that the possession of his home creates in him, the worker, a complete transformation. With his own small home and garden, the worker becomes the head of his family, worthy of this name. He is moral and provident, aware of his roots, and exercises authority over his family. It is therefore of immense social importance for the worker to possess his own home. Soon it is his home which possesses him, it gives him morals, it establishes him, it transforms him. So in France, these 19th century working class settlements were called cités ouvrières. And they were first introduced by Napoleon III when he took over in 1848, the Second Empire. But they grew in popularity years later, around 1880s. And on the one hand, Napoleon wanted to introduce them in a way to pacify the poor population and win a favorable stance towards the imperial regime. On the other hand, the industrialists, which were mainly Protestants, also embarked on a grand worker improvement schemes to portray their paternalistic benevolence, that we care for the worker and therefore we want to assist their life. So among those, the most exemplary one was the Cité ouvrière in Mulhouse. Mulhouse is in the eastern France, in the Alsatian region, which is in the borders between Switzerland and Germany. And here is Cité ouvrière within the city of Mulhouse. So Mulhouse had a tremendous economic and demographic development at that time. It was growing out of a small-sized craft town to a really medium-sized industrial town that by the mid of 19th century, it was already known as the French Manchester, or the city with 100 chimneys. And Cité ouvrière was built then at this point, between 1853 and 1897, for the workers of the Dollfuss Mig and C factory. Maybe you know it. It's a very famous textile factory, DMC, that basically was started in Mulhouse. And it was a textile mill and the principal employer of the city. And basically, the Cité ouvrière was funded by the Société Mulhousienne des Cités Ouvrières, which was a housing association for all the working class settlements in Mulhouse. And the head of this association was the head of the DMC factory, called Jean Dollfuss. And the mission of the, call it SOMCO, this is the name, SOMCO, was to improve the life of the workers. So, from a social, political, and economic point of view, one of the reasons that I looked at the case is because it is exemplary, and it has influenced a lot of other European cases, industrial and post-industrial. In Germany, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Britain, even though they were competitors. A lot of settlements for the, sorry for my German, Farbwerkehorst or Bochumer Verein or other root mining companies were inspired by that scheme. It also inspired entire neighborhoods in the Brussels, like Cité de l'Intude. In fact, as I said, Britain was a competitor at the time. A British magazine called Engineering reported that the model of this Cité ouvrière was the most effective one and much more effective than its British counter-examples in decreasing labor disputes and increasing industrial productivity. So it was already at that time considered as something really special. And the most interesting part for us is that the urban layout and the architectural design, as proposed by the engineer and architect Emile Müller, received great attention, and they won the Golden Medal during the International Exposition of Paris in 1864, when the exposition back then of architecture was about working class housing. And the settlement was conceptualized as a utopian suburb with narrow and grid-like streets, individual generous gardens for each house, and communal facilities. Does that remind something? It's very much like the Garden City, but only years before it was even conceptualized by Ebenezer Howard. So Cité ouvrière started as a projet idéal, basically a utopian project to shape the moral and the spiritual qualities of the working class through the design of the urban configuration. This is the plan that Emil Müller proposed in 1853, where he proposed 320 single-family houses arranged rationally on a regular grid. He provides large street area that covers a third of the total plan. A third of this is actually only consisted out of streets, and also there is two major streets, so basically this one and this one, that intersect at the center at the square, and the square and this square concentrates all the public amenities. Public amenities considered at that time is something special. Public amenities like communal center for reading, learning, but also like a refugee kind of what they call a school, public baths, wash houses, butchery, bakery, grocery store. So literally public amenities. And three things, what I find interesting in this plan, there are three things. First of all, that the kind of square, it is not only the spatial center, but also the social center of the scheme. The second one is that there is a high ratio of streets, and this is not only as a result of the fact that you have single-family houses and it kind of like this plot-block ratio kind of dictates the fact that you will have many streets, but it was also part of the hygienic principles that they wanted to apply, that basically every house has direct access to the street. And the third one is the uniformity. Pretty standardized, pretty uniform, and there's a repetition, you have regular block geometries, and basically this is very much like reminds of the standard layout of the factories of the time. So whether if you were in the factory, if you were at the house, you had the same kind of standardized layout. Eventually, the utopian plan was never fully materialized, as it happens in most of the cases, but it was materialized partially. So, what was the reason? Well, not all funding was available at the time the construction started. And second, also not many workers at the time of construction showed interest to buy or rent the houses at that point. So basically Somco doesn't have a lot of money, and therefore it considers in a very pragmatist way, can we actually build all of it? No. They decide only to build 200 houses. Then you can see that the north-south kind of gets shortened axis. The central square is cut down to half, and also the communal center is dropped. Still though, there's a lot of qualities that were in the previous plan, they are still there. For example, you still have public amenities, even though not all of them. You have the high ratio of streets and the generous open space that you can see in every little garden. You still have the direct access to the street. You do have this regular block geometry and uniformity, but you also have a great mixity of different typologies. Now for the typologies, there were three initially typologies. Two of them were inspired by the British. So terraced houses, which I hope you all know, terraced houses is when you are, you know, you can see faces that you know. If you don't know, just, I can quickly explain. Okay, great. So terraced houses. Are they houses that share a wall with the next houses, but not on this level, but on like the parallel walls are shared. So basically they are terraced houses like that. And then the other British typology is the back-to-back. That means that they share three walls. So they only have one free facade, the other three is basically joining to adjacent buildings. So these two typologies were already known and built in Britain, but they introduced a third one, which is a French kind of invention by Emile Müller, which is the quarter detached. Quarter detached is, again, they share two walls, but instead of this, they do it like that. So you have this kind of, I don't know if you can see this kind of squares, where basically there are four together, okay? Now this was called carré Vélousien. Okay, keep that in mind because I'm going to talk about the typologies. So even if it is uniform, it actually has pretty good variety of three different typologies at the time. So the two subsequent phases, so it happened in 3 phases. That was the first one, and was considered to be the most successful one in terms of socially, but also in terms of economically, and I will further elaborate on that later. But the 2 other subsequent phases were not as successful in the sense that from a social or economic point of view at least, okay? So you can see that pretty much they followed the same urban layout and architecture. So basically these linear streets, they extended towards the west, and here is the DMC factory. So actually they reached the factory straight, so it was like a neighboring relationship between where they worked and where they lived. But they, even though they kind of followed the same, there are certain things that are different. First of all, they kind of drop 2 of the 3 typologies. Why? Because the terraced is this one, for example. The terraced typologies were very expensive, and they couldn't afford to build them because no one was buying them. The back-to-back, these ones, were actually cheap, the cheapest one, but they were not serving the hygienic principles. They didn't have cross ventilation, and they didn't have adequate lighting. So they dropped that as well. What they come up with is they just continue this quarter detached typology. But still, even though it is successful among the workers, it's still expensive. So what they do is that they shrink it even more. You cannot see it in the plan because nothing changes on the footprint, but it actually, the square meters are much, much less. We're talking about a square meter of 36 square meters. So this was the kind of house they provide for the workers, and it is a cheap house, and actually workers can afford it and becomes a huge success. They built around 1,000 of these houses. But again, there was some compromise on the original utopian social view, and that was, for me, it was not a failure. It was very much kind of like a pragmatic approach, given the kind of challenges that we have to face. So Somco struggles to sell or rent the houses, and there is also an economic crisis between 53 and 56. And also, given that we don't know whether there will still be interest of houses for the ones to build, we are taking the decision to do some compromises and change our agenda. And that is what Jonas, who has done a research on Mulhouse and working class settlements, and he's actually a professor, a sociologist from Mulhouse, had called an inventive pragmatism. Now the land, interesting, I didn't talk about the land yet, but the land belonged to the Jean Dolfus. If you remember, he was the head of the DMC, also head of Somco. So actually, he had bought the land pretty cheaply because it used to be an area that get it flooded by this canal. So the canal is here, and used to get flooded. But what they did is that they kind of reopened this discharge channel, and then they actually allowed for the land to be buildable. And then the land he bought, it was very, very cheap. So he had the land, so they somehow continued with the cité. By the time they reached the 3rd phase, which is this one, they readjusted their agenda again. What happened is that they stopped and abandoned cheap housing, and they said, no, we will no more do cheap housing for the unskilled workers, but we will do larger housing that we will sell to the better off workers, that they could then partition and sublet to other workers. So in a way, they did larger houses that they could and allowed workers to sublet. Very much like a way to use housing as an instrument to generate profit. We will talk about that in a bit. So, having said that, why I believe the cité ouvrière is different? So, because of 5 characteristics. First one, a possibility to access to property. Second one, the funding model. Third one, its location, the potential for adaptation of the houses, and the cultural and social model it promoted. Let's start with the first one. So basically, as I said, it offered all segments of workers cheap housing and sanitary houses, but also it gave for the first time in history, the possibility to access property, to purchase your house after 13 or 15 years. And it did that without forcing the workers. So they were not forced to do that. They were not forced to buy, and they were not even forced to live there if they wanted to work for the factory. So this is kind of interesting and different. And also, only workers could buy these houses. Nobody else as a private kind of investor, developer, and so on, outside. The third one, the first location, the funding model. Now this is quite interesting because it is the first location outside Paris that government funds were used to assist a private project. Very interesting. Not only government, like national funds, but also municipal funds. But it is interesting because the state fund, it was there for the first phase, but not the subsequent two. So we're talking about state funding, a partnership between public and private for the first cité, between municipality, the national government, and the bourgeoisie, the industrialists. And then we're just staying with the municipality and the industrialists. Still, the state, in the first phase, gave 300,000 francs to provide all the public amenities, plus infrastructure such as streets, sidewalks, trees, and so on. It was, for me, this kind of partnership, it is the clue here. It is what makes, because they shared a vision, and they shared a desire to actually contribute all together. Interestingly, other cities in France wanted to imitate the same model. Lille, Roubaix, Bordeaux asked Mulhouse to send the plan of the cité so they can build them. But actually the motivation was not there from industrialists, neither the state or the municipalities. So eventually none of them did the plan. Of course, as I said, cheap land, that was very important. 1 square meter in Mulhouse, it was 1 franc, while doing the same in Paris would cost 75 francs per square meter. And also the third one was, how was the funding and the mortgage by some cost? So basically they were operating through a philanthropy of 4%, which was in opposition to the British, which was 5%. You may think 1% is very low, but actually makes a huge difference. And what it means is that they were only claiming back 4% of the original capital from the workers, of interest, 4% of interest from the original capital. So, it was very interesting as a public-private partnership, as a calculated financial risk from the private sector, SOMCO, and also it actually offered quite some innovative new infrastructure in terms of hygiene, sewage, and so on. And not to forget the public amenities. So, the settlement was originally built at the northwest periphery of Mulhouse, next to the DMC factory, so pretty much a suburb. But as the city expanded, the city actually embraced Cité Ouvrière and embedded it well into the network, both on the local and on the wider scale. Effectively, what was once a kind of remote area gradually became a central quarter which stand out, it's very much different from other European company towns. The spatial analysis that I told you previously that I run on the network, on the street network of the region around Mulhouse, showed the degree that this area is integrated in the network of the region. By integration, I mean the degree of accessibility. Okay, and by accessibility means that the warmer is the color, like the red, means that it has higher chances, not higher chances, that it is more accessible in the network. More accessible, that means that can be reached easily by the inhabitants or by the strangers. Or the inhabitants of the area can reach all other points of the system very easily. And this is something that, despite the deindustrialization of Mulhouse, the fact that all the industries have left or closed, there are still workers living there. This area has not been abandoned, which is usually the case of housing next to factories. Once the factory is closed, the housing is getting abound. It's a pretty lively area because it is very accessible and people want to live there. So another type of analysis, this basically means it shows all the shortest path in the city. And why this is important? Because basically it pinpoints all the thoroughfares, basically what you use to move through the city. Any origin, any destination, what are the streets that you're most likely to pass through if you want to move between any origin and any destination? And interestingly, my area is a purely residential area, so there is no actual point why you would want to get to pass through it, but it is next to thoroughfares that have the potential to accommodate move and flow. What that shows is that maybe not within your residential area, but just one click away, in the basically perimeter of that area, you have move and flow. Non-residential land uses like shops and supermarkets and grocery stores and hairdressing and so on are actually settling in along these streets. And then you have immediate proximity. In your immediate proximity, there is a diversity of land uses. So people, they don't have to go far to do their daily errands. Still, for me, the most impressive characteristics of the Cité ouvrière is the adaptive capacity of the houses. Of course, this would not have been possible without a flexible legislation, which actually not only understood what was happening, but also responded to either the formal claims of having inhabitants to change their houses or the informal and illegal ones. So it was actually readjusting, the legislation was readjusting itself to accommodate these adaptations. At the beginning, SOMCO, the housing association, was disapproving all changes because they actually believed that the uniformity of the design, that this is rupturing the uniformity, and we want the uniformity because this goes well with the low-cost housing and also makes our area exclusive and very different from the rest of the city. However, they couldn't do anything about it. And even if they were calling this architecture of the poor, they couldn't do because the workers were the owners now. So what happened is the uniformity slowly but gradually ruptured and changed, and what used to be a uniform and very monotonous layout and scheme turned into a quite formally, morphologically diverse city quarter. What did they do? They incrementally expanded and demolished their houses, changed the roofs, facade, fences, doors, windows, and gardens, opened and closed down local shops and workshops, rented out and sold entire buildings or parts of them. Even though all typologies accommodated changes, the Carré Mulhousien, the quarter detached, they allowed the highest number of interventions because of its special configuration within the plot, which basically allowed two facades to be able to expand it, one in front and one next to it. And additions were possible because at the beginning they provided so much of generous open space. And this surplus of open space in the gardens, in front and next to the houses, provided room for appropriation. So the design was actually able to afford the changes and remain relevant over time. We're talking about something that it was built in 1853 and still remains relevant today. And still today, residents want to invest money and time to make it grow. So if we really think about it, what are growing houses? Are sites that keep expanding, that are multi-generational households can occupy them, that intensify social interactions then in a small amount of space. In Cité ouvrière, this led to people develop local networks and friendships, and inhabitants actually deciding to stay in the area. I went through the municipal archives, and what I noticed is the names of the owners, and actually they were relatives and friends, and they would keep mentioning each other. The urban design also created a feeling of neighborliness that had a positive effect on the production of and maintenance of the social life. For example, Müller introduces a type of street that was called passages at the time. These are very narrow streets of 2.5 meters that were basically allowing for lateral north-south connections. And these were so tiny that it was not about basically the big movement flow to allow through. It was only about service roads and were allowing for the water pumps to be there, also neighbors meeting. It was very much about the domestic intimacy. And these are when everybody thinking about Cité ouvrière at the moment is actually having these narrow passages in mind. So it's very much linked with the image of the neighborhood. Another example is the public facilities that helped strengthen the relationship between the inhabitants. So in 1861, about 150 women would visit the communal laundry each day, and more than 120 people would take a bath every day. And basically, the urban space became an extension of the domestic space and a space for social interaction. I went through the socioeconomic analysis to actually make the point that there has been a persistence on the presence of low-income working class population in the area. Workers are still there. They have been changed basically because this is a modernist 70s building that happened much in the 70s that was very far away and is actually quite struggling today. But there is still a high percentage of workers living in the area. And that is a consistency. That is a consistency that I consider a positive thing, maybe even a solidarity, because these characteristics naturally attracted also migrant communities, which were very much moved into the area. They were coming from places like Turkey, Northwest Africa, Italy, Portugal in the 1960s to find jobs in the industries, automobile, Peugeot, Citroën, they're all there. And they were coming in Mulhouse, and they were relocating from place to place. One of the main anchor points in this residential parcours was Cité Ouvrière. Oh, you don't see what I see. Okay, so these are actually the families in their houses in Cité Ouvrière, and you can see where they're coming from and how many years they live in the area. And so a high number of immigrants actually settled in the area. And as I said, it became one of the anchor points of immigration, my area. So you can see how different family constellations and different 38 years they live in Cité Ouvrière from Portugal, Italy, sorry. So, very interestingly, so that obviously served. Okay, I can still keep talking though. Yes. So basically, the whole area became an arena for intercultural encounters, right? And the co-presence of different ethnic communities and very heterogeneous, which actually allowed marginal and kind of fragile population to feel like they're belonging and they can find their identity and solidify their social networks. So you don't see there, but you have a number of sociocultural associations that suddenly emerge in the area. You will see the association of the Portuguese. You have the Centre Socioculturel Lavoisier Brustein, the Centre Social et Culturel Papin, and they all advocate for social inclusivity, literally cohabitation and integration of the different ethnic communities. And I will continue and saying that, in fact, in Mulhouse there are more than 140 different nationalities. For a city that's so small, that's a lot. And actually, if you would see where these are placed, 35% of the population that it is in my area is actually coming from another background than France. And the local authorities actually recognize how valuable this is for the cité itself, that in their projects to kind of do something about this area and renovate and help it, it's all about reinforcing the ethnic diversity. So they are talking about building a mosque rather than anything else. And this is the map of the different population of immigrants in the city, and this is the area that you can see the percentage, and these are the kind of like where they're coming from. So you have a lot of Maghrébins, which are North Africans, you have a sub-Saharan Turkish a lot, and Italian, Portuguese, and so on. So, to summarize, so that was a good stop actually. So to summarize, so Cité Ouvrière started very much as a philanthropic act of the Protestant bourgeoisie, that they wanted to offer cheap and sanitary housing to workers. It was different from other company towns because it offered access to property, yes, and also it had a welfare policy, work policy, that was actually meant to help create a sense of belonging and a community. Besides though there's public facilities, it also, and I didn't mention, offered pension schemes and mutual aid funds and free medical service, cooperative shops, so other kind of things that help building the community. But the aim eventually was to restructure the society, was to prevent social disorder and increase productivity. However, even during the construction time, and this is important because we don't, if the best of the case, we might do a research about a case study after it finished. But also we saw that even during the construction, the same project would keep readjusting itself, very much obeying a kind of very pragmatic approach to what is planning and architecture. So some of the first ideals were compromised. Yes, they were. So private property eventually became, even within the third scheme, an instrument to generate income for the workers that could sublet their houses and also pay back their mortgage. But they would also, and obviously this started as a utopian, a social, very much socially driven utopian that gradually turned into a, let's say, enlightened capitalism, and then further on, during the time, it literally became a very liberal economic model, where basically all decisions are made by individuals, and in this case, the workers, the inhabitants. Especially, we saw that how this was being reflected, right? By the individual changes made to the houses by the inhabitants themselves. And what used to be a top-down, planned, kind of all at once, maybe 40 years, but all at once scheme, became a very much bottom-up, emerging scheme that was very ethnically and formally diverse. Now, for me, the most important thing that this tale, what I call tale, tells us is about the dynamics between the actors that they were involved in the process. So, we have the private sector that is represented by the industrialists and the bourgeois, who are very willing to provide, and they are actually willing and they have the means to provide housing and to solve an acute housing problem. Their motivation, though, is relied on personal gain, and their strategy is actually limiting workers' autonomy. Then we have the public sector, either state or municipality, that they are actually good at securing public infrastructure and land, and they can also ensure that there is an equal distribution of resources. But the direct commissions for them are very costly, their budget is meager, and they're very reluctant to define longer-term strategies. Third, you have the workers, the users, the inhabitants, who access ownership and take an interest in investing economic capital as well as social capital in the area. They take part in common activities, organize community groups, and develop networks within the area. They also develop networks across different ethnic groups. And they boost the feeling of belonging and identity. They transform their houses, piecemeal, claiming their right to their built environment, and create what I call a slow participatory design in a way, even though it was never intended to be one. A slow participatory design, which actually turns themselves, what I said at the beginning, within a period of 165 years, from passive consumers of a product and service that was given to them by industrialists to actually active participants in the aging and life of their home and neighborhood. And in that sense is what I consider, and only in that sense, I consider ownership and physical adaptability as an essential expression of social empowerment and active citizenship. And this is very important in nowadays, and going back and linking to the challenges, the global challenges of today, is very important when we are talking about planning and providing for communities in our contemporary world, especially for communities that are low income, fragile, where they are almost never part of the planning or the building process. It is a story, I think, that it needs to be told in times, as I said, of immigration, in times of mass displacement, of housing crisis, and maybe the lessons that we can learn from that, we can basically think how we can integrate when we think for the future and current policies or future planning strategies. So thank you.